All right, we appear to be live. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's Thursday, October 22nd. My name's Christy Bolingbroke. I'm the Executive Artistic Director for the National Center for Choreography. And it is my delight to get to speak with choreographer Adam Barruch this evening, calling in from Brooklyn, New York. Adam, hello. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm
Great.
doing well. How are you doing?
Doing well. Absolutely. I mean, it is happy hour. I'm opting for a little bit of water because it was nice and warm today in Akron. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm also drinking water as well.
Now what is your go-to beverage of choice normally for a happy hour?
Usually I have to say I like kombucha.
Oh, and wait, do you make your own kombucha?
I do. I brew my own kombucha. There's many jars on top of my refrigerator right now.
Okay. I think that there's a possibility there, always good for some alternative revenue streams, right? Like how else you might need to barter.
For sure. For sure. I can sell some kombucha.
That's good pandemic planning. Excellent. Well, if you are not brewing your own kombucha or want something a little stronger than water, we hope that you will grab a craft brew from GroundWorks partner 80 Through Brewery for the Artist Talk series. Adam and I are going to talk about an upcoming project, but before we get to that, I was super excited to realize when we connected, you were a part of my first Akron Heinz Pole Summer Dance Festival Groundworks experience because they were performing your work in a cemetery of all places. So, why don't you take us back there? Tell us about your first experience with Groundworks and like what was that piece?
Well, my first experience with Groundworks was creating a piece called Hex. And at that time, I was really interested in the magical potential of movement. I had been watching a series on the Sci-Fi Network called The Magicians. And The Magicians was sort of like an adult Harry Potter about people going to graduate school for magic. And in the series, it's based on a series of books as well. The magic is performed without words, without wands, but only with words and very, very detailed, very intricate geometric hand movements. And being a choreographer that's sort of obsessed with arms and hands, I thought if that was my job for the rest of my life, making hand spells for this show, I would be the happiest person alive. Um, so I was really inspired by that, and I wanted to create a piece where the movement was abstract, but also was based off of the idea that each movement was potentially a spell as well.
That was my bad. That was exactly the moment that we had the realization of hands. I was like, wait a minute, I have seen this because I remember it was with the grimoire and it was so intricate. And I think Felice was dancing then. And the just the specificity of that in a new way, right? Like we know that there's a certain sort of language in ballet. There's a pomp, a circumstance, you will now dance for me and rolling through. But the fact that you were really exploring that and finding your own language, that I immediately recalled, and it felt really apropos to revisit it because 'tis the Halloween season. If we're going to talk about magic and hexes and witches,
For sure.
right?
For sure.
We're so on board.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious how hex and maybe mysticism also might relate to the name of your company, Anatomy Occulti. I don't know all my Latin, but I have a feeling that those kinds of things have similar root words. Tell us more about where that came from.
For sure. Anatomy occulti means the hidden anatomy or the occult anatomy. And I was searching one day for a drawing that sort of encompassed many systems of subtle energies in the body. And I came across this diagram that had the chakras overlaid with the Kabbalistic spheres and had a lot of astrological symbols drawn into their corresponding anatomical parts. And at the top of the chart, it said Anatomy Occulti. And I just always was so taken by the chart itself that when it came time to pick a name for the company, I thought that's the one. And I know that it was so probably challenging for other people because it is difficult to pronounce and read, but there really was no other choice once I realized that I had such an affinity for it.
Art is supposed to challenge people, I think sometimes. Not as a hard and fast rule, but I think it's okay to do that for sure.
For sure.
Great. And you do have a fascination with the body, which may be a duh statement for choreographers, but particularly with your looking at the anatomy, your being able to identify the interest in the hands. And then you also have a practice that you have codified, for lack of a better term, called dynamic sequencing. What does that mean? And maybe you could even demonstrate a little bit. You don't have to get up, but I just would be curious because I don't think a lot of people can take dynamic sequencing classes wherever they are.
For sure. Well, dynamic sequencing sort of came about because I needed a practice to warm my own body up. And I was finding that previous methods of warming my body up, such as a ballet bar, weren't necessarily applicable to the kinds of movement that I was doing working with a choreographer up in Montreal. And I found that a ballet class sort of locked my system up a little bit too much. So I started to rely heavily on moving on the floor so that I could sort of disengage from gravity and start to fold and warm my body up solely from moving the skeleton without the weight of the musculature around it. And I also was being asked to teach a lot of courses at universities. And I thought to myself, I need to create some sort of system that warms people up in a way that's universal enough so that they can go off and do whatever they need to do during their day. And over the years, it's developed into a system that really promotes body and mental awareness, and also how to mobilize in the most organic and efficient manner, mostly initiating from the skeleton and allowing the rest of the body to follow. So I talk a lot about skeletal landmarks in the body and how they relate, especially when we first start the class, to the floor, because the floor, when it's behind us, works as such a great anatomical alignment tool. You have a surface, you can place a bone on it, and then you know where you are in space, and you can start finding where your whole system relates to that one point. And then once we start standing, a lot of the standing work is really inspired by Limon technique. There's a lot of fall, catch and release, and a lot of sequential movements. So meaning that I'm going to start the movement maybe in my shoulder, and it's going to then go to my elbow, then go to my wrist, then my finger. So there's a sequential nature to the movement in the natural progression in which my body would normally flow. So it's learning how to understand all of those concepts, but also to allow the central nervous system to stay as calm as possible so that we can make the most beneficial choices while we're in movement, so that we never become sort of stuck in too much force where we're not able to change trajectory, and therefore we might encounter some injury.
Mm-hmm. You're laying down so much knowledge and information. I want to remind our friends both on Zoom and on YouTube, please feel free to submit your questions as we go along. We would be happy to welcome them in. You don't have to wait. There's no formal procedure until the end of our discussion together. So please, we welcome those. Any questions for Adam, and we'll add that to the discussion. I'll bring it back around because I was also curious to find out what else you've been doing during the pandemic. In addition to kombucha, you just admitted to us that you've been doing some painting behind your left shoulder as well, but you're in school. What are you studying?
I'm in my first semester in learning Chinese medicine and acupuncture.
Mm. I mean, from my vantage point, all of this is totally related,
For sure.
one to the other, and it's just expanding and widening your circle. Is there anything that has surprised you so far from your studies? You said you just got through midterms. I'm sure you went through sailing.
Yeah, my midterms are done. I did very well. I'm very happy. I think what's been so amazing is to see how much care and how much knowledge there is in the information and how and over how many millennia it's developed, and every single thing means something. One thing I could say is, we were studying this 24-hour cycle of energy in the body, and at which time the energy is most prevalent in which body part. But the
Mm,
entire sequence of this 24-hour cycle is elemental. It's relating to nature and how nature unfolds, but also how we unfold as human beings. And so the whole 24-hour cycle is based off of, how we begin life as a body, how life starts to activate inside of our bodies, and then how we gain passion, and then how we have to temper that passion, and then become a balanced human being so that we can achieve our long-term goals. So
mm,
within something that's very abstract, that's just energy flow, there's this sort of microcosm that's very human and quite special. And I think I didn't really know as much about that going into it. I know from an experiential place of having acupuncture done how potent and how much change I can feel after having a session. And I've always been interested in it enough to research it and to understand that it was inspired by nature, but not to the level at which I'm learning now. So it's been very inspiring for me to think about how I can also maybe apply some of this information into my artistic life as well.
yeah, when you talk about the body as a system, and even in dynamic sequencing, how that is a system. Now it feels, if we're thinking like in concentric circles or the larger ecosystem, and the context for which bodies operate in. I hear so much of that with all these different layers and the elements that inform it. I'm curious, blank page, where do you begin with a work? Whether it was with Hex, you talked a little bit about the background and books and shows that you were watching, but is that usually where you find inspiration, or what sort of habit do you have to catalyze the creative process?
A great question. Usually, I start with an overarching sort of idea about what I'm interested in researching. And like you said, that does usually come from books, movies, television, anything that inspires me at the time. As with Hex, it was reading different mystical texts and um, watching the magicians and being inspired by the actual hand movements that I saw in the magicians. But I always come into the studio teaching the dancers movement that's based in my own body. And usually that original phrase is separate from the thematic element that I'm interested in exploring. It's usually something that's more instinctive and just ephemeral. It's usually I probably will create it in the studio as it's happening. I might prepare a little bit beforehand, but I do like the pressure of having to come into the studio and make something on the spot. And
Mm,
usually I can access some new territory when I do it that way. When I do prepare movement, sometimes I have a tendency to repeat patterns because I'm just falling into things that I like doing. Whereas
mhm.
in the studio and I'm surrounded by different people and a different atmosphere, I may choose things that I wouldn't normally activate, for example. So
Yeah.
this usually starts with that first step of just acclimating the dancers to a physical vocabulary.
Hmm. And given our conversation about Chinese medicine and the elements, it almost sounds like dancers, the people in the room, can be elements that will somehow impact where you will go with a project. Is there something particular or a series of some things? What do you look for in a dancer?
Um, you know, I really just want the dancers to feel comfortable and to be able to feel safe enough to express themselves in their own idiosyncratic way. And that's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for their own individual way of approaching whatever I've given them. So basically, after I do teach them movement, I will ask them to respond to several prompts that relate to the theme that I'm interested in developing. And that's my way of really understanding where each person is and what their own unique voice is, and how I may be able to incorporate their unique voice in my own vocabulary. And I'm really looking for their input, because I want to create, in the long run, a piece that's, based off of their intrinsic gifts and not mine in particular. My voice will be heard because it's through my lens, through, my organizational lens, but I really want the vocabulary to be something that represents each unique voice.
Yes. We're going to take a brief break from talking about the dancers and people for a minute. We have a question from the internet, and specifically asking for, besides the magicians, are there any other TV shows, movies, books that have inspired you? And did they result in a new dance? Are you just constantly binging through Netflix and making up dances all the time?
That's a really great question. Books that have inspired me. I have to say the first one that comes to my mind are the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. Um,
Mm.
I really love looking at his drawings and seeing his note-taking method, and have always been interested in him as a person, because he's such a unique and, interesting individual in history. But just that book also has inspired me so much in just developing my own technique in researching the body.
Mm.
I think with Hex, I was reading some Kabbalistic texts. One which was the Sefer Yetzirah, which is called the Book of Creation, which is sort of like a primer for how the universe was created. It's based in Judaic mysticism, and really explains how the universe was created through the vibration of the Hebrew letters and through permutations of the Hebrew letters. So that was a text that I was reading at the time we were creating Hex. And so I think that definitely found its way into the creative process for sure.
So the magicians was some of the more lighter fare that you have found inspiration in. I love it. We have
That's
another question.
not to
Yeah,
say I do like to read Harry Potter as well. So
okay.
we're good.
You're like, yeah, you on the spectrum. Um, we have a question from GroundWorks Artistic Director, David Shima Takahara. Thank you, David, for calling in. And he specifically is acknowledging the upper body, the arm. We talked about the hands, the gestural nature of your work. Can you talk more about how that became a focus of your movement, right? Because we could have a whole other discussion if people are born a choreographer or become choreographers, but you had a very full life as a performer in Broadway shows and with other companies over time. When and how did gesture and the hands become more central to your movement identity?
That's a great question. I think, when I was in high school, I had come from musical theater, so I was really taking a lot of musical theater dance classes. I was really obsessed with Bob Fosse's vocabulary for many years, and probably also because it was sequential and detailed and precise. But one of my teachers, while I was in high school, suggested that I look at the work of Yuri Killian.
Hmm.
And that was the first time I had ever seen, I guess, what you would call contemporary work. And his work, though very highly based in sort of a mix of ballet and a more contemporary vocabulary, created a lot of work that was highly gestural and arm driven. I can remember, there were a lot of, percussive movements of the arms. And so that was, I think, the first choreographer that I noticed the arm work so heavily used. But then, I think the real transformative process for me with arm work was when I saw the work of Pina Bausch.
Mm,
That was really when I found a work that I truly deeply resonated with. Not so much the theatricality of it. I mean, I did resonate with that coming from a theater background, but what really caught me was the sensuality and the dramatic quality that was really about gestural storytelling, and especially the movement of the women I was so taken with. I remember seeing my first Pina Bausch piece live at BAM, and I just had never found a movement vocabulary that I resonated with so deeply. And then what I would do is I would go and research more of her work. I would go to the New York Library for Performing Arts, and I would watch tons of archival videos of her work, and I would go home and go to my basement at night with the screen, the glass door, open, and I would just try to imitate what I saw and try to understand the physical patterning of her movement. I wanted to understand what was the impetus that was causing people to move like that. And once I discovered why people would move that way, then I started to sort of break away from research and start generating movement that was more based off of my own impetus and exploration.
mm. I thank you so much for sharing that. I don't know that a lot of artists could pinpoint that specifically too. And it also makes sense, one, not only in the watching as viewing, but then to take it home and try it on in your own body, find what that means, find probably a lot of new things that you discover. It's not just copying that great dance video that we love online. I mean, I definitely practice Rhythm Nation ad nauseum at home, right? Let's take it back. But that was more out of emulation as opposed to try to understand from the inside.
For sure. And I think what was so amazing was when I realized that all of the arm movements were expressions of an inner landscape, that the
Mm,
movements were not solely these abstract, distal, like, you know, um, patterning, but it had a deep, deep sense of feeling with it. And I think that was really what I was trying to figure out was how do you relate your inner landscape to something that's so far away from your body. And
mm,
I really, really loved the discovery process of that. And that's also where my joy is in my movement. That's where I go to immediately. It's always in the hands, it's always in the arms. And I think as long as I'm moving, I'm sure that will probably be the case.
mm. Well, it's an interesting distinction too. The word ornamental came up, right? That a lot of hands, the incorporation of the hands in many other art forms, as well as in for dance, can be there's that added hand flick. It's more of a punctuation point as opposed to a starting point for the
Yes.
movement and understanding that. So that's I'm gonna watch totally differently now. I so appreciate that.
Yay.
So we were talking about dancers a little bit though, because when you did last come through with Groundworks, it was almost an entirely different cast, right? Dancers grow up, they move on. Felice, had retired. What are you thinking about as you return to Groundworks? Have you gotten to know the dancers yet?
I haven't had an opportunity to know the dancers yet, but I'm super excited. And I think, going back to what we were talking about, it's going to be such a joyous process to get to know them through creation and through prompting them to create themselves and to see what vocabulary we can generate together. And that's just such an exciting prospect and something I haven't really been able to do for quite some time because of the pandemic. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this time period has evolved my process and seeing how things are different now because of everything that's occurred.
And do we have your dates when you're coming in again? I'm trying to imagine what you may be reading around this time so that they could bone up.
probably still be reading some of my textbooks from school. So
Okay.
I'm sure that this piece will, as the last piece was about the body manifesting power to control, I think this piece will probably be manifesting the power to heal. I think that's
Mm.
really what we all need right now and what the world needs right now on both a microcosmic and a macrocosmic level. And that's where I'm at right now. So I think that's where it's going to be led.
No, it's beautifully put. And also just speaking of sequencing, the way that you can talk about your work, I happen to subscribe that everything an artist makes is somehow related to the next thing that they'll make, and it's somehow related to the last thing that they made. And that's not always so evident, but for those of us that watch and follow artists and kind of trace that trajectory, you've organized it that way for us, of course, in true fashion. You're like, this is how it goes. We're like, all right, there you go. I'm curious, how do you identify the sound score? And at what point in this process? Because there's some heady ideas. We're talking about movement. Where does music or a sound score come into your process?
Such a great question. And usually I work with a composer named Rourke Menzies. And Rourke is a Brooklyn-based artist, and he's such an incredible magician. And usually what I do is I will go to Rourke, and I'll say, this is what I'm interested in exploring. These are the ideas, these are the books, these are the thematic elements that I'm exploring. And he'll go, these are what I've been working on. This is my exploration. And Rourke is an incredible artist. He basically creates a sound score by manipulating his own voice. So he'll record his own voice through a microphone, and then he feeds it into this huge system
Mm,
of gadgetry and creates these electronic scores that are so almost cinematic and three-dimensional. They're really like soundscapes that really reflect an environment. And usually, what I'll do is I'll go to him a little bit before the process and have him start to work on the score so that when I go into the process, I'm able to play that music as we're creating so that the dancers are able to sort of steep themselves, within that audio and create a movement vocabulary that's also reflective of that sound.
mm,
Um, with Hex, I wasn't able to work with Rourke, but there were sort of multivarious tracks that I was really interested in utilizing. So I think with Hex, I ended up playing 3 tracks simultaneously for a great majority of the piece, and they just sort of overlaid on each other and created these really interesting textures. And then, sort of later in the piece, I started to manipulate them a little bit on my computer. But I did have those soundscapes available to me when I did start the process.
mm. We have another great question from a music fan listening in with us. Have you ever used live instrumentation for music? And how might that, as an element, influence and change the work you create versus a electronic score?
That's a great question.
We
Yes,
only accept great questions. I just want to.
I have. I've worked with a composer by the name of Stephen Weinstock. And Stephen Weinstock was my teacher at LaGuardia High School. He was a pianist, a dance pianist, and accompanist at LaGuardia High School, and was also the dance accompanist for my Comp 2 class, my composition class at Juilliard.
You go way back.
Yeah, going way back, and I'm still in touch with him today. He's such a brilliant mind and such a kind soul. We come together on a lot of similar things that we enjoy. He is at the moment writing a novel based off of reincarnation and the Scheherazade, and he's a genius. I mean, he's amazing what he can do. But going back to the score, I've worked with him on several scores. One was for the piece I made for the Graham's second company, Graham 2, and he utilized a prepared piano. I wanted to give reverence to the fact that Merce Cunningham had been in that space prior to Martha Graham taking over the space on Bethune Street, and I thought we have this amazing old piano in the corner. We should really utilize it and go John Cage. And he was able to play and create a score that was really evocative of what we were working on. And that was an amazing experience. Also, to have another set of eyes in the room during the creation, because he was creating the score as the piece was being created. So that was also really helpful in navigating the creation process. But also hearing what he was playing for certain helped me navigate what I wanted to make as well.
Yeah, music and dance, particularly with original scores, can always be a question like which comes first,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit. So I never make presumptions about that. Appreciate it. I am fascinated from your collaboration with Rory, just thinking about the body as a system, the technology and sound mixing as another system, so both organic systems, technological systems, and then reminded of another artist that I will paraphrase. Mark Morris has said before that the dancer and singer have the most in common because we are working with the same instruments, which is the body. So even though Rory's becomes manipulated in this technological sphere, it started from an organic place. And that also really hit off of some alarm bells for me as you were talking too. I don't know if you've thought about it that way.
For sure. I mean, Rourke's work is super corporeal. He uses his whole body while he's, creating the sound, and he often does live performances while he's usually in galleries or other kind of spaces. And it's so interesting to watch him because he's not only vocalizing and utilizing his body to create the sound, but he's also manipulating the sound through all of the gadgetry. And you can watch him in process moving his hands and changing this dial and that pedal, and then going back to the microphone. So he's moving and dancing as well while he's creating sound. So I totally resonate with what you said for sure.
Mm, nice. I might have scared people off with questions before when I qualified that they all have to be great. We will take good questions too. I just want to say we welcome all questions coming through. This happy hour time is available. Thanks so much to everyone who has tuned in. We have a little more time together. I would love to ask you, Adam, what is the best piece of creative advice that you've ever received?
Oh, that's a hard question. We've gone from great questions to hard question. The best piece of
Those
advice.
are also welcome.
um, I think, I have an amazing friend and mentor named Margie Gillis, who is a solo artist up in Montreal and around the world. She's been doing solo work for 40 years or so, and is such an amazing example that I've sort of followed throughout my career. And I'm so blessed to know her and to have worked with her, to have had her as a mentor, to have created on her. And she once told me, and she received this information, I should preface this, from the angels. And she said to me, "You need to slow down." She said, "You need to slow down. Um, you need to slow down." I think she was talking both in life and in creative work. I think at the time I was moving in space with such speed, and she said to me, "What you can do with speed is so amazing and it's so hypnotic, but sometimes you have to let the audience feel like they can do it."
Mm.
And I think that was really, I could get very emotional. I don't know why I'm getting so emotional about that piece of advice, but it was really about connection and allowing the audience to really be connected to what you're doing. And I think there's a point when you can dazzle and hypnotize, and then people stop paying attention because they're not fully engaged. They're just sort of separate from what they're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a time when they can be so invested in it because they can be so involved in it because they understand it. And that was really, I think, one of the greatest pieces of advice I've ever received.
Mm. No, it's beautiful. And thank you so much for honoring her and bringing her into our conversation too. We have a couple questions. After you answer them, we can decide if they are good, hard, or great, um, or if there are new categories. So there's a question that we have when you are sharing your style with dancers for the very first time. I feel like a first date. What is that like? They're new to your choreography.
It's amazing. It's one of my most favorite times because it's so pure and it's such a moment of genuine sharing. And I tend to get very silly when I get in the studio. It's sort of when my like Leo comes out, and I just bubble, and I get so excited about the sharing process. So it's just pure joy to watch people go from not knowing anything coming into it and then slowly finding their way, and that moment of realization when you know they have it is really one of the most satisfying things for sure.
Mm. And there is a sense, both from inspiration, from your own history, working in musical theater, that you do relate to narrative. And David is actually reminding us of your adaptation and reimagining of Sweeney Todd. So would be really curious, how do you navigate, and not that it's an either or, but there's sort of a continuum between theatricality and narration in relation to abstraction.
Sometimes what I'll do is when I'm prompting the dancers, I will prompt them to create scenes, if you will. They don't necessarily have to be anything that feels connected to the greater picture right away. It's just something that inspires me, something that I would like to see play out. And I'll give them, for example, in Hex, I think it was Lauren and Stephanie. I said, make a scene for me about if you were sneaking into a room that you were not allowed to be in, and this was your first exploration with this magical text. What would happen? Uh,
Mm,
that would be one of the first things that I would do. I would sort of initiate a narrative in that regard. And then what happens is through the creative process, all of these separate scenes are generated. And the fun part, and sometimes the most difficult part, is stitching them all together
mm,
to create this overarching narrative that I don't have any idea of when I first start the process, but definitely reveals itself in the final stages of creation.
mm. Have you ever worked with a dramaturg or a librettist in any way to do that stitching part?
Yes, I have worked with a friend of mine named Lauren Albert, whom I've worked with a little bit at the Stella Adler Studio of Acting. And she has definitely come in at certain points in my process to just sort of see if it's making sense,
Mhm.
and will definitely give me adjustments if things aren't necessarily clear. I've had partnerships that way. I've also had Marky Gillis come in to be the dramaturg and mentor for my Sweeney Todd project as well. To sort of have, she was actually in it as the beggar woman, which was an amazing experience. But she was also able to step out and to give me an outside perspective on whether, things were shaping in a way that felt logical.
Mm, mhm. It brings to mind often when talking with a dance civilian, and they're like, "What do you mean you don't have like a script?" Yeah, and we know that dance, there's Laban notation, but there isn't a universal way of writing things down or as a score. Um, do you have any such practice? Because you talk about stitching this sort of narrative. How do you like to document your work?
A lot of it's through my notebooks. So, my notebooks will start with a chart of everything that everyone's created. And what I'll do is, usually in the first part of the creation, I'll have everybody get up and perform all of the separate phrases that they've generated or all of the scenes that have been generated. And I'll document them in my notebook. And then I'll probably at one point circle the ones that I feel are somehow connected to each other. Not necessarily the ones that are better or worse than each other, but ones that I feel are relevant to this entire picture that we need to make. And
Mhm.
so from that process, what I might do is I might come in one day and say, okay, we're going to do part A, part C, part D, part F, part G. Let's see what happens. Let's just see what happens and see what the narrative is. And sometimes that will yield something that makes sense and feels right. And then sometimes it doesn't, and then I'll rearrange and try it again. And then when something feels like it fits, I'll take note of that and kind of put that aside and go, okay, that's definitely part C and part A work really well in conjunction. That's going to be section one. And
Mm.
then we'll try something else. So it becomes just sort of an instinctive and intuitive process of really what feels relative to each other and how they need to be ordered so that you come away feeling like you've been on some sort of journey.
Mm. It's also what's great about working with dancers live in a studio is that imagine you can toggle and say, we're going to do ACD. Well, now let's do ADC. And do you feel differently having gone through that experience differently? And they can talk back to you about that in a way that when we're editing things or working with, finite non-human materials, they don't always talk as clearly, maybe, back to us.
For sure. And then that's part of the process too, is getting the feedback from the artists because they're in the end the ones who are performing it. And if something doesn't make sense to them, the narrative won't be clearly delineated, and then the audience probably won't understand it either. So it's really important that, everyone is on the same page and that it feels truthful and authentic for them.
Mm. So it definitely doesn't sound like you work in a linear or chronological way. It's not like, great, beginning of the score and just through. How much time ideally do you need in the studio to make a work?
It depends. I sometimes work really well with limits. So if someone says you have 2 weeks, you have 10 days to make a piece, somehow that generates some sort of panic and something comes out. The panic isn't usually there at first. The panic is usually once everything's been generated and then I have to put it together. That's usually when the sleepless night comes in, and or I'll leave the studio, going, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And then at dinner that night, I'll go, oh, I think I know how this is gonna be put together. But definitely time limit, definitely helpful. Limitation, mother of invention, so always helpful. But with Hex, what was so wonderful was we had 3 weeks together. So we came out. My collaborative partner, who I work with in New York, Chelsea Banoski. I've been working with her for about 11 years now, and we do a great majority of our work together. She came out to Cleveland with me, and we had a week just to get to know the dancers and to not have to immediately put things together. So we taught some duet work that Chelsea and I had created together. We generated some movement material just to get a sense of everyone. And then I knew that coming back, I would have 2 weeks to kind of piece everything together. But having that extra third week of exploration was such a gift because it really gave us some time to understand each other on many different levels. And I was very grateful for that extra time always.
Mm. I so appreciate the acknowledgement that it isn't always just a gift from the angels, right? That need another element, another response. And I think that creative panic or adrenaline with a deadline is always appreciated. I'm curious, what do you do if you are stuck in a rut? You're in a creative place and nothing's working or you just don't know where to go next. Do you have a habit or practice that you can share?
Yeah, one of them is to stop what you're doing and leave it. That's a really great one. Instead of trying to kind of overwork and rework and overwork and rework, which no one enjoys, especially having been on the end of processes where choreographer has done that. I usually leave it or I ask the dancers, quite honestly, because they know. So I might say, I don't know what I'm doing. I want something like this to happen. Does anyone have an idea? Does anyone understand from the inside how this might happen? And usually something happens and we can keep moving. I've had that happen a lot. And so I'm always open to suggestions in the middle of the process because you never know where you can get inspiration from. And I certainly don't have all the answers for sure.
I like that idea that you would ask someone else for help loosening the jar. You're like, hey, wait a minute.
Yes.
Excellent. I'm going to give out a last call to our friends and family and audience members who are tuning in. Last call for questions. I'm going to ask my last question now, but we are happy to hear more. Ah, well, here's one before I ask my last question.
Okay.
What's plan B in working with Groundworks if the pandemic makes it dicey and we are unable to be in the studio together?
I think the plan is to make a beautiful film. It's been interesting during this process of creative exploration during the pandemic and utilizing Zoom as a means for creating and exploring. As a teacher in many universities, I've been teaching a lot through Zoom, but I've also been having some creative processes, making solos for dancers via Zoom, and it's an interesting challenge and an interesting forum. Again, to ask, when you can't be in the space moving, to ask the dancer to generate and to give feedback, via Zoom. Um, so I think utilizing these different tools would be an amazing way to see what else we can generate.
Mm. We we spoke with another artist a couple weeks ago, Kara Hagan, who is she codifying a term called artistic surrogacy that sounds almost a little bit like some of the work that you've been experiencing through Zoom. So yeah, I think that's definitely in the zeitgeist right now for sure. Um, Here's my last question. You have found so much in the time of COVID, right? Both from teaching, you're painting, you're going to school. What else in terms of art making? I won't even limit it to dance. What else do you have cooking that we should know about?
Well, Chelsea Banoski and I have a film that we've just created. We were very, very lucky to be given space at an art gallery in Sunset Park called Art Cake, New York, NYC. This beautiful, huge, vacuous gallery with cement floors and extremely high ceilings. And we had the luxury of going in and just being able to utilize the space however we wanted. And that was an amazing experience for us to come back together after so much time apart, but to also navigate moving through space again. It was a real challenge, aerobically and physically, just to navigate having space and moving through space after being, stuck in our kitchens or our living rooms for so many months. And so the exploration for us was really just acclimation, both to our own internal space and to the space around us. And we were able to document a lot of our explorations, and we created a film that's going to be shown at the gallery very soon. So I'm very excited about that. I always love working with Chelsea, and I'm always inspired to work with her. And she's such a rock for me in both my personal life and my creative life. So that's kind of the first thing I can think of creatively. and then just continuing with the other teaching engagements in school. And I'm going to continue just to express myself however I feel like I can in these times.
Nice. Are you teaching anywhere publicly via Zoom that's not at one of the colleges if people do want to explore your work with you now in this moment?
Yes, I teach every Thursday via Gibney Dance. And Gibney has a whole series of online classes going on right now with incredible, diverse artists. And so I teach every Thursday from 11 to 12:30. It's mostly a standing practice because not many people have access to a lot of floor space right
Mm.
now. So I've just designed the class to stay standing and to work vertically, but I teach every Thursday. So you can find out more information via Give Me Dance's website. And so you can come join me in my kitchen and take a dynamic sequencing class. And I'll also be doing probably a more explorative workshop via Gibney in November. Not sure of the dates yet, but if you stay tuned via Gibney's website, they should be releasing the information soon. And that probably will have a little bit of dynamic sequencing, but plus some exploration of some more choreographic material that I've generated.
Thank you. I know Groundworks usually hosts master classes and a variety of activities whenever bringing guest artists into Northeast Ohio. But for people who just can't wait and want to start doing their research and exploration, that's what I was thinking when you told us about studying Pina Bausch at the New York Public Library for the Arts, because I was like, this is all our library online with the onslaught of content certainly there. So we can start to engage with you. I was certainly reminded as you were talking about dynamic just in my chair. I was like, oh, that's right. I should sit up a little bit taller. I haven't spent nearly enough time on the floor, working on that sequencing. So thank you. Thank you for being so open. Thank you for being so generous with your process and really authentic and honest. I can't wait to see what you make Groundworks next. So.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very honored and very excited to begin the process.
Cool. Our friends on Zoom, we're going to discontinue